In class, we had begun to talk about American Romantic landscape painting by looking at these two artists from the Hudson River School, Thomas Cole and Jasper Cropsey. And we've been talking about various issues about seeing the divinity in the landscape, about extolling the power of nature, how Cole and his interest in Freemasonry has something to do with the way he envisions the world, how Cropsey invites us to enjoy this sort of idyllic, peaceful countryside like the hunters that are hidden in the forest. In our museum visits, we looked at the works of Albert Bierstadt, which I'd like to sort of present to you a bit more thoroughly in a unit. He was a German artist who spent most of his career in America. He grew up in Massachusetts, but then moved back to Europe in the 1850s and made various sketching tours in Germany and Switzerland and Italy in the middle 1850s. He then came back to the United States in 1857 and using those sketches made paintings, and this was probably the most important and the most powerful of them all, 10 feet across the base as you remember. But again, it's painted in the studio and based entirely on sketches he had made on site. This dramatic landscape, again, showing the power of nature, we are led into it by a path that leads through the woods and into the valley below. It runs us past a group of gypsies and actually opens up to a recognizable village in the background. This is the village of Brunnen. And we can see also recognizable Alps in the distance for different alpine peaks here, all of which can be identified. And here we can see, I believe this is St. Goddard here on the right. So again, these are elements that can in fact be recognized, and he's taken these very dramatic scenes. Notice the village, second village up in the hill here with its church on the ridge there, more houses scattered down the path that leads to the valley floor here in Switzerland, and smoke rising from the cottage chimneys. He fleshes this out with all sorts of pastoral vignettes. We've talked about the idea of a rustic, unchanged landscape in various artists' works, such as Constable in particular, but also Thomas Cole. And so here we see a harvest scene, figures working in the fields, gathering hay onto the wagon, another field of herbs and flowers here having been cultivated. We have a religious procession on the right leading up and into the churchyard here. There's a group climbing this hill. This is a standard trope, a standard theme in landscape painting going all the way back to the Renaissance, where we have a high road that leads to salvation and a low road that leads to sort of secular pursuits. And I think that Bierstadt is working that same idea, the high road up with the church and the low road down to the village. Again, it reflects this idea that the landscape is our lives in a way, and that as we travel through the landscape, whether visually or in reality, we experience a microcosm of our life, our travels through time. And we've talked about a number of American artists who see America as the promised land, as God's glory. Well, this is obviously filters over to this image, even though it's not America, even though this image shows Switzerland. He exhibited this picture at the National Academy of Design in 1858, and it was a huge hit. It was his first painting that he'd ever exhibited in public. And on its merits, on its strength, he was elected as an honorary member of the National Academy of Design. And the next year, he decides to play on that strength and goes west, looking for America's Alps and the Rockies and the Sierra Nevadas. in the company of an Army survey team. So he ends up sort of making his career based on this picture. Here we see a scene from the Sierra Nevada mountains. Originally, when he first exhibited this work, and again, it's about 8 feet across, it was simply entitled Mountain. But what's happened next is that the Corcoran Gallery here in D.C. bought Frederick Church's massive picture of Niagara Falls that we saw before. And Bierstadt wanted his works to be represented in that gallery as well. And so he offered this painting to them and told them that it was Mount Corcoran. And he even gave them a surveyor's map to prove it. You should buy this picture because the mountain is named after you. But what's interesting is that Bierstadt named the mountain himself after he made them the offer for the picture. So he really ended up making his mark on the West in order to get them to buy this picture. Of course, they did. Now, these landscapes are intended in many ways to introduce this majestic view of the West and its glories to the people of the eastern United States. And none of them are really accurate. They're chock full of details that he has sketched on numerous occasions from various views, and he puts them in regardless of how they related to one another. All of this is obviously meant to support the idea that this is God's promised land. And it is our destiny, our manifest destiny, to move into this empty country, us being the white settlers, move into this empty country and make it America. As I mentioned at the museum, Bierstadt's conception of landscape is probably inspired by how people were viewing photographs at the time. Photographs were believed to record more detail than the eye could actually see. And when they were exhibited in public, people were given magnifying glasses to look at photographs with. And Bierstadts are very much like that. They really do include more detail than the naked eye could ever see. And they invite a sort of a lens-like scrutiny. We talked about the tubes he had people view these through. Certainly I think what he's doing is he's making things that are unlike photographs that are seen, viewed in the way that photographs are, with great scrutiny. I mean, no photograph would be 8 feet across the base, no photograph would be in color. Bierstadt's bringing something new. And we looked at it in greater detail down at the Smithsonian. Another work of art that came from the Corcoran collection to the National Gallery is also based on sketches made on site. Bierstadt described having actually seen this particular view in 1859 when he was with the Army survey team, but again, he painted 10 years later. And here's what he said, and notice, by the way, the power of nature with this developing storm. He said, one morning we saw a noble-looking animal crossing the river near us, talking about the buffalo. As he came splashing through the water, I felt half inclined to lay down my rifle and take up my sketchbook. But I was so wrapped in admiration and in study that I could do neither for a few minutes. So he's totally struck by the power of this Western nation that he's exploring, really amongst the earliest explorers there. And again, gives us this idea of the buffalo moving out of that lightning storm as it gathers. Certainly I think this storm that he shows really is the single most romantic element of this image. Again, the power of nature literally obliterating the mountains that it moves over. One last Bierstadt picture here, the last of the buffalo. This was his very last large landscape. Again, it's about 10 feet across the base, which is interesting for us because Lake Lucerne, which we started with, was his first. And just like Lake Lucerne and other pictures, he's cobbled together different views and he sketches at different times and in different locations. And again, it's very romanticized as a vision. The title refers to the main scene of an Indian killing a buffalo. And you'll notice this human endeavor against a very powerful nature. Our buffalo has a couple of different arrows in him are Indian going strong, the horse terrified by the battle. Certainly the idea of the last of the buffalo is a dead buffalo, a couple of them right in the foreground, foxes waiting to take the meat from the Indians, but look at the carnage by this field of bones placed in the foreground. So the title, The Last of the Buffalo, really relates, I think, in many ways to the idea that the buffalo are disappearing. But at this point, this romantic view of a time when no one thought of the last of the buffalo, when in fact the deep fields are dotted with buffalo as far as we can see. Bierstadt is in many ways being romantic for our past and lost time, but at the same time focusing on these romantic elements. Now, this relates in many ways to a huge change in taste. His first image, Lake Lucerne, was very well received in 1858, but Last of the Buffalo was rejected and he submitted it to a jury in 1889. He wanted it to be shown in the 1889 Exposition Universelle, the Universal Exhibition in Paris. And that exhibition was all about the theme of progress, the advance of progress in the modern world. And so the theme was, I think, in many ways showing this period, this time that we had lost. The American community didn't want anything to do with it. And by the way, the Eiffel Tower was part of this as a symbol of French industrial progress. So Bierstadt uses it to counter that idea in his Last of the Buffalo, to show, in fact, that there was a time when we were in more harmony with nature, that there was no way we could actually kill them all, but maybe industry could do that. The American committee, when he showed it to them, said it was just too big to send to Paris, and they were just being polite. They thought it was too old-fashioned. And this really ended his career of making these huge western landscapes that we've been looking at.